continue with Vanessa Lamb, who's also a PhD candidate in geography at York, and is affiliated to the York Center for Asian Research, to WISIS as well. So as far as I could understand, I think that Vanessa's work sort of could broadly be located at the intersection, or a place where three main themes or field of study interact, or there's an encounter of those three. So there's development and conservation studies, critical development and conservation studies, theories and debates on the production and the use of knowledge, and the sort of field of science and technology and how it relates to production of nature. So for doctoral research, she's studying hydroelectric development project in Thailand, and she's paying special attention to the process and the role of expert in making knowledge for and about these projects, maybe for, about, against these projects, including the expert working on them, but also reflection on the role of academics in this process. As well as looking at the ways these development projects influence the way people make claims to space and place. And today, Vanessa will obviously, since it's the Critical Border Studies Speaker Series, present part of this research, but more closely tied to borders.
Yeah, so I was going to draw on the board, but we don't actually have anything to draw on the board. But the place I'm working at is right at the Thai-Burma border. So there's actually there's a series of large dams, but there's one in particular that I was following first. And this is actually located like at the political border. So all of these questions come up around if you have a large dam that has a large reservoir, all these questions around territory and sovereignty and actually remaking the border kind of come up. And so in a way, I'm kind of following this project before construction and looking the way that different kinds of knowledge or science or whatever are kind of reconstructing or remaking the border here. But I'm kind of trying to link this idea of reconceptualizing the border through this natural resources development as connected to some broader debates in geography, which are really talking about are the importance of borders increasing, are they decreasing, and then kind of some newer work that's been focusing on the question of who borders, so who is actually part of these practices, performances, really drawing on Butler, which I kind of wish I had drawn that out a little bit, hearing what you were talking about. And so that's kind of where I'm interested in here. And so I'm looking at this question of who borders, and I'm bringing in some potentially unlikely characters into this mix. So kind of different groups of non-state actors. And what I really want to think about is a couple things. One, in the context of Southeast Asia, for those of you who aren't familiar, the borderlands or the frontiers are really considered like uncivilized kind of frontiers where they're, wastelands just waiting to be developed. And this is very true of the Thai-Burma border. And part of this argument that I'm making about looking at the way that people are actually at the border involved in these processes is thinking through the idea of agency and how it actually does matter what people do here with regard to how things play out. Again, I'm looking specifically around natural resources issues, but I think there's some other points that I could talk about. So to draw out this, I'm actually drawing on this concept of border work, which is developed by a scholar named Chris Rumford. He's a political geographer, and I really like this idea because it's borders as something that get done. They need to be maintained and created, and there's a kind of action that's involved there. And he says, or Chris Rumford says, that border work is less and less something over which people have no control. He really highlights the possibilities for the border to be done differently, and also this kind of idea of border work doesn't necessarily privilege the role of the state in looking at the border, but can, as some people have argued, potentially democratize or open up the possibilities for a more democratic idea of a border. But for me, I'm really interested in the possibility of having a variety of actors kind of be involved in the remaking or reimagining of the border, because with kind of increasing development, you have this kind of different kind of actors that are coming together here. So my contribution maybe to this concept, or drawing it out a little bit more, is really highlighting this idea of work. So the idea that borders require work. It has to be maintained, surveilled, etc. And so someone has to do that. And so I'm going to go through just a couple examples from my field work, but first I just wanted to provide a little bit of context because I think it helps make my argument a little bit more clear for those not familiar with the Thai-Burma border. But this is just an image. You're looking from Thailand over to Burma across the Salaween River, which is where one of the large dams would be constructed, and it's also in the foreground here is a tobacco garden. So gardens are planted all along the river by people who live here during the water's low season, and then when the high season comes up, it brings rich sediment loads. And so some of the groups I'm talking about today in the right-hand bottom corner are a group of environmental consultants out there to do surveys for the Hachi Dam, and then at the top left is a village headman. He lives in one of the villages along the river, and he's been involved in this villager research project, which I'll talk a little bit about. Okay. So just to let the Thai-Burma border, just like I like Nate's idea of the European fictions of the border. So this is a border that was demarcated by the British in 1849 when they were doing their colonial thing in Burma. And that's how, there's actually a scholar, Thongchai Winataku, who makes the argument that that's how actually Thailand was created, is through the different kind of negotiations over political borders with the colonizers around the country of then like the Kingdom of Siam, but present day Thailand. And so the part of the border that I'm looking at the Salaween River was actually demarcated by British officials. They were really interested in the timber trade at the time. There was a lot of valuable teak, and so they wanted to have exclusive rights to the resource, and they actually demarcated the border with the help of the Karen, which are a group that have lived in this general area. They are one of the indigenous groups in this area and still live there today, and they're a group that I will be talking about. But another thing I want to highlight is just before this time, and even after 1849, the kind of arbitrary nature of the border. So in maps and in discussions with people who live there, engineers, etc., the border has really shifted over time, and so it's kind of arbitrary, which a lot of activists build on, is kind of pointing out just the contingency of the political border, which I think is an important part of the discussion. But just to note, part of Thongchai's argument about the making of Thailand is that with this kind of import of the concept of the Cartesian line idea of the border, so the border as an exclusive line, you really had impacts on kind of indigenous ideas about space. So potentially previous to this, you had overlapping kingdoms where the border were more ambiguous, and you might actually be a part of two kingdoms at once. And so with the exclusive kind of idea of this line, it kind of changed conceptions of space. And so just kind of a little bit of background on that. And this is what I wanted to kind of explain by drawing out, but there's a series of dams that are proposed on the Salaween River, 16 in total. And so this is the Salaween River, if you can see this. It goes all the way up into China. And this is the part of the border that I was looking at. It goes down to here. And these are some of the dams. There's actually 5 dams that are proposed right here. And this dam down here is the one that is going ahead first, at least potentially, as part of the plan. And so, let's just see here. Oh, okay, so obviously here is Karen State in Burma, and this is Karenni State and Shan State up here. And these different, these different ethnic groups pretty much live throughout northern Thailand and northern Burma, even though they have fixed states in Burma. They're not necessarily, things are changing, but they're not necessarily fixed in those places, obviously. But I guess one thing I just wanted to say here is that with regard to the Karen in particular, they've been kind of traditionally seen as groups that are very close to nature, far from modernity, you could say. And they're very usually characterized as people who really, love nature or love the environment and try to protect it. And they're kind of seen as kind of the guardians in a lot of discourses in Southeast Asia, held up as this. And actually, otherwise, James Scott has kind of characterized the Karen and other ethnic groups in this area of northern Thailand, northern Burma, as kind of state evading. So the fact that they're at the political border is not, a coincidence. It's actually like why they're there is because they're groups that the way they're organized is, more of a state evading strategy to be in these kind of upland areas. So I'm not saying I necessarily agree with either of those arguments, but just to keep in mind when I'm talking about these people actually doing the work of the border, kind of presents a little bit of a contradiction. So one other thing that I just wanted to point out in terms of context is that right now there's a lot changing in terms of the development climate within Burma, and so just last month, Hillary Clinton, I think it was in December, went to Burma for the first visit by the State Secretary in a really long time. And just after, they announced that the World Bank and IMF would now be entering Burma, along with a host of other development organizations. And the EU, I just saw an article yesterday that says that they are considering lifting sanctions, or at least some of the sanctions. So there is this kind of development context that's coming in, and it's not just happening right now, but it's in part of a longer process. And the dams that I'm looking at, I have investors from Thailand, Burma, and China, and another project has some from Malaysia, but this is obviously kind of an increasing environment for development. Okay, so going back to my idea around border work. So again, I really just thought, during my research, I thought it was really important that there were all of these different actors coming together at the border, and in my opinion, really doing the work of the border that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So environmental consultants is one of those groups. So just one particular example that I want to talk about is this group of consultants that were hired to carry out the environmental impact assessment for the dam. And so it's a really large dam, more than 3,000 megawatts, so it's, there's reason for an impact study. And it would be located right on the main stream. The consultant's work actually was really touted as this great example of how to do development process, because it's one of the first EIAs that's been done in Burma. And this is really, really good for the consultants who did this, because this promises them future work in other kind of projects that are coming into Burma. But really, with the environmental impact assessment itself as a report, as well as the process that kind of came with it, there were some serious problems. And one of the issues that I just wanted to highlight is the way that the border was kind of reimagined or re-narrated as part of this. And so, the conclusions of the EIA really support the project, as maybe can be expected from environmental impact assessments across the world. But one of the kind of surprising things is that the consultants concluded that this project, which is on a transboundary river, right near the political border, would have impacts in Burma. So on one side of the border, they recognize it would have significant impacts on fish, migrations, the ecologies, as well as relocating people. But they said that on the Thai side of the border, just upstream, there would not be any impacts. So, okay, that's very interesting. Why would you say that? I mean, how could you even scientifically prove that? And so that's kind of one of the serious problems with this EIA. But I think what's interesting in terms of, and just let me mention that it's not just in the report that this is just mentioned offhand. This is actually something that the consultants went out and reported to villagers as part of stakeholder meetings. This is part of what they report to the government committee that's tasked at looking at this project, etc. And so for me, basically what they've done here is reimagine the political border as a barrier to impacts, which is quite interesting and maybe a different interpretation of the border, really reinforcing this as a borderline that's a barrier to impacts. And while it doesn't really make sense intuitively, it does make sense if you want to remove certain groups, individuals, their knowledge about this project out of the decision-making process, or even as stakeholders as part of this process. Because maybe it's the same in Canada here, the EIA is important in determining who is potentially impacted as part of a development project. So if you're not potentially impacted, then you're not necessarily formally a part of that process. So this is one example. And this ties in, interestingly, with another project that was going on. This is by the Karen, which is villager research. And the main idea is pretty simple. It's participatory research where the villagers are the researchers and you have organizations coming in that are supposed to be the research assistants. So the motivations behind it are really advocating for resource rights and increased participation in, resource access and providing information about those resources. And I think it's important that this is called, in the context of Southeast Asia, that this is called villager research and not, for instance, indigenous knowledge or, for instance, citizen science, because villager is a particular political category that has fixity and integrity within this context. So I can talk more about that, but it's a strategic move. And so what they've done as a part of this project is, produce maps, books, posters, and videos documenting natural history, agricultural practices, cultural issues, as well as village histories, and presented that in a variety of forms. So I think this is really interesting in a whole host of ways, but one point I wanted to talk about is the way that they've really narrated their increasing responsibilities and surveillance and role in the border along this area as part of their village histories, which is potentially unexpected. So just to provide an example here, as part of a meeting, villager research in a group of interviews I did based on the village history, it was explained to me by a number of different interviewees that in several villages along the river, committees have been established specifically to monitor the border area and to decide on who is allowed to build houses at or move into these villages. So, for example, anyone coming to this area, either from Burma or from other parts of Thailand, would have to apply to the village committee in order to get permission to build houses. These actions and decisions are, things that are from the committee are carried out, like for instance in the village meetings, which they have once a month, as well as in stakeholder meetings about the dam. So they talk about this kind of committee development. And they've also met with government officials, coming to their villages, asking them questions about the dam, and also presented this kind of information. So it's something that's been narrated in several contexts. But again, it's written and documented through the Villager Research Project. One village headman explained to me that the village is an important role. This particular village has an important role in the district. It is the gate between Thailand and Burma. We're the eyes and ears here. It is important to have people in this village as gatekeepers at the border. So really kind of emphasizing their own role in surveillance at the border. And I also think it kind of shows how this is just again, kind of the actions and decisions and narrations of this, how this really relates to the remaking or potentially reinforcing of the border. And just a side note, as I mentioned before, this kind of goes against the ideas of, for instance, James Scott, who talks about these groups as like state evading, which I think misses maybe some of the nuances here, because I think some of the motivations, at least in part, for documenting your histories or talking about your histories as, situated in a particular place for a long time is strategic to gain access to rights. There's issues around citizenship, like documentation. And so I think that talking about these groups as state evading kind of misses out on some of those nuances of the struggles that people are going through to try to position themselves. Just one brief example. This is terrible because it's all in Thai, but these are some maps, the digital maps that were produced. So map making was an important part of villager research. And just, I guess one thing I just want to pull out for this is a map of ecosystems. So they documented a bunch of ecosystems and villages and things along the river. But the interesting thing to me is the fact that the left side of the map, which is supposed to represent Karen State in Burma, is blank. And so this really serves to kind of reinforce, it raises a lot of questions, but it also serves to reinforce the political border there. There's not really any question of border crossing or dynamics or trade. And I know that's hard to represent in a map, but this is just a really interesting example of that. Okay. This is something that I'll get to in a second. So I have 3 points that I wanted to draw out, just kind of summarizing this. So first, I think it's interesting how both the work and documentation and kind of the acts of people that I'm talking about, both environmental consultants and local residents, actually tend to reinforce rather than contest or challenge the political border. And so they have very different motivations. As I mentioned, environmental consultants really have, there is a really big conflict of interest with wanting to get the next job from your employer, or even get the right results on your report so that your employer is happy and hires you again. But also, in terms of like people living at the border and participating in villager research, it's a strategic decision to kind of bolster claims for land and access to resources, or even potentially, for some people, citizenship. And I think that in some way, and I've discussed this with there's 3 local groups that are working on citizenship issues in this area, but I think it kind of poses some challenges to some of the work that they're doing and some of the assumptions that they've made in, for instance, documenting histories and whatever as part of this villager research. But I also think that these examples kind of show how these acts of border work actually matters to how the border unfolds in a way. So I feel like if, in a way, if local residents weren't there surveilling the border and kind of being a part of this, as well as the consultants weren't there kind of reiterating Thailand's claim, actually I would see it as to like a particular territory. I think that there's just, this is potentially some maybe, I don't want to say potentially to be done differently necessarily in a more democratic way, but it's, there's a variety of actors here involved that might have different motivations that you can kind of understand through looking at the work that they're doing instead of just assuming that they're either contesting or challenging the political border because they have some type of affiliation with like anti-dam activism or whatever. And I think in the case of the environmental consultants and the EIA, it's really clear how like remaking the border in this specific way matters to kind of some of the outcomes of this development process, for instance. And maybe the most obvious point is the fact that you can see how environmental consultants and local residents or villagers here are actually part of this border making, and they're not state officials. And I guess this does, obviously, it runs in contrast to any idea that this border is being superimposed necessarily from outside, although I think there is a case that it's just definitely reinscribing a nation-state level. So it's not as though you're remaking the border necessarily in a more democratic way. But I guess what I was thinking about with regard to these Saloween residents is kind of describing themselves as gatekeepers and working for the border is that this is a very informal relationship. So there is no formal position associated with doing this surveillance or putting these committees together. And so, despite maybe potentially strategically increasing their connections to different state agencies and interests, they're not necessarily positioning themselves in a less precarious position. So they're still like rather informal relationships, and potentially doesn't really provide them that much help or facilitate any specific rights or guarantee any rights with regard to land ownership or for some people with regard to citizenship. And so I guess overall what I'm thinking of is that through looking at the kind of actions and performances and documentations, you really see kind of more of a nuanced idea about people in this area not necessarily being ignored or being uncivilized or being not involved in the state or state evading, but you have these really informal relationships with the state and the interests of the state, and not just the state as some big entity, but different parts of the state, like the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, the different ministries that are involved and have stakeholder meetings here, as well as border guards and police, etc., that come to these meetings, which is kind of facilitated through a lot of these ongoing development processes. And I guess that's the final thing that I'd want to say is that I think it's important to look at these questions around who is doing the border work in the context of this kind of increasing development around the border, because there's this climate of increasing investment from an even larger variety of actors now, and so this can kind of help understand how the border spaces are being remade, renegotiated, etc. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, 25 minutes.